Hi there, welcome to the archives. This week I'm doing an audio recording of a blog post that I originally posted on October 11th of 2020. It's titled Parable of the Talent, Unraveling White Male Power, and it uses Octavia Butler's novel, The Parable of the Talents, to talk about white supremacy and shame, as well as how it intersects with patriarchy. Because this post deals with various forms of physical, emotional, psychological, sexual, and racial violence, I want to issue a content and trigger warning. Please proceed with care. Set in the future of 2032, in Octavia Butler's novel, Parable of the Talents, the socio-political and economic climate in the United States has worsened since its prequel, Parable of the Sower. The plot takes place in a time period referred to as the Apocalypse, or more commonly, the Pox, which lasted from 2015 or perhaps even before the turn of the millennium through to 2030. What the protagonist Lauren describes as a decade and a half of chaos. In the story, there are several small, bloody shooting wars going on around the world. That is a direct quote. Meanwhile, in the United States, Texas Senator Andrew Steele Garrett has been inaugurated as president and declared war with Canada and Alaska. In the novel, Alaska has gained independence from the US, and there are also talks of Texas doing the same. The nation is in, and I quote, climatic, economic, and sociological crisis. Education has become more a privilege of the rich than a basic necessity. There is dangerous environmental degradation, and poverty, hunger, and disease have become inevitable for more and more people. That is a quote from page 8. These regressive changes suit the president just fine. He is an alt-right, white supremacist, capitalist patriarch and a leader of Christian America, also known as CA in the novel. A ruthless religious sect and secret society made up of thieves, kidnappers, slavers, and murderers, created to, and I quote, help make America great again. They're extremists who believe that re-educating heathen adults and placing their young children in Christian American homes is the only way to restore order. And that's a direct quote. You can find these quotes in page 306, page 19 to 20, as well as page 322. And the Help Make America Great Again quote is directly from Octavia Butler's words. And she wrote this book, I believe, in the early 90s or late 80s. A fascist organization, members of Christian America have been known to form mobs and burn people at the stake for being witches, who the president claims are nasty, very nasty. These are direct quotes. Again, you can find this on page 89. Does that sound familiar? Christian America gives readers Ku Klux Klan vibes, also known as the KKK, a real-life white supremacist domestic terrorist organization with roots in Christianity. The KKK relay white supremacist ideologies about white people being more superior. They have been known to use symbolic representations of power, such as the crucifix cross, to lynch Black people and burn their homes and churches to the ground. In Talents, they call themselves Garrett's Crusaders. They are determined to take over those they recognize as shameful threats, including Lauren, the protagonist, who is a Black, queer, disabled, working-class woman living with a condition called hyperempathy syndrome, also known as sharing. Jared is hungry for power and abuses anything that he is given or takes. Through the president, Octavia Butler addresses the historical nature of white male supremacy, its inferior and superior complexes, its savior complexes, power abuses, domination, and the element of materialized fantasy that comes with it. Black feminist activist Doris Davenport, Jewish feminist writer Gloria Black post-colonial theorist Frantz Fanon, and French African scholar Ikile Mbembe all address the pervasive nature of male fantasy. White male fantasy given power can unravel as laws, legislators, policies, scholarships, etc. What was once an illusion becomes concrete and real. And they really do think that is their reality, that it is real, even though it stems from a fantasy. The president weaponizes shame, among other strategies. He inflicts violence on numerous communities which he propagates are a threat to the state, Black and brown people in particular. They also include, and I quote, cultists, anyone who doesn't quite match Garrett's version of a Christian. They include Muslims, Jews, Hindus, Buddhists, Mormons, Jehovah's Witnesses, Catholics, atheists, or well-to-do eccentrics. He identifies them as shameful and immoral subjects to be done away with, or disciplined and punished back into what he perceives as the straight and narrow path to what he calls God's country. Christian America takes readers back to sites of white violence, such as the theft and exploitation and enslavement of Black Africans, the US government overthrowing and occupying the then independent state of Hawaii, led by Queen Liliuokalani in 1893, or the inception of the Ku Klux Klan following the Civil War, well into the Civil Rights Movement and the modern day. The literal castration of Black men, whereby their genitals were kept as a sort of a souvenir by white people following their lynching. That's so demonic. And let's not forget Jim Crow laws. That's their history. Such unfounded and barbaric logics are in line with real-life historical events such as the Salem witch hunts in Massachusetts, germ warfare conducted by the US military against indigenous people in 1837, whereby European settlers gave native communities smallpox-infected blankets while withholding vaccines from them. Think of that in the wake of COVID-19. Could you imagine our governments putting this virus in blankets and giving it to indigenous communities on purpose so it would wipe out their communities and then withhold vaccines from them? Can you just imagine that? This is American history. Also American history are scorched earth policies where native lands, including their crops and whole villages, were burned to the ground, or the criminalization of indigenous cultural and traditional practices, such as powwows and sweat lodges, where they were not allowed to practice their religions or spirituality. And these implementations were set in place by racist and anti-indigenous policies like the Indian Act. In the novel, gone too are the days of women's rights. Instead, gender disparities are rampant. The humanity, livelihood, and labor of women and girls are devalued and exploited. Octavia Butler writes, little girls are valued because they can be used in so many ways, and they can be coerced into being quick, docile, and disposable labor. End quote. And that's from page 40. On the other hand, here's another quote. Repression of women has become more and more extreme. A woman who expresses her opinions, nags, disobeys her husband, or otherwise tramples her womanhood and acts like a man. She might have her head shaved, her forehead branded, her tongue cut out, or worst case, she might be stoned to death or burned by Christians doing God's work. So Christ-like. That's from page 50. Historically and today, patriarchal churches and governments in North America, if not globally, have played a major role in giving men a lot of power over women and children. The given assumption has been that men are superior to women and therefore should be treated differently, which has always meant better. Men, white men specifically, are in most cases afforded more power over women, even within queer and trans communities. In this regard, missionaries have taught millions of people that women should submit to men, directions that can easily be taken out of context and typically used to justify violence and abuse against women and children. Based on statistics, there are millions of men in the African continent and globally who were indoctrinated to believe that women are the property of men and to do with as they please. Women, it is said, are to be grateful that men want to claim them as ownership. In this way, women are expected to stay in abusive and violent relationships for the sake of being married. The argument goes, it is more important that a Black woman be seen as a respectable and virtuous woman, even if it means death. A good wife endures pain and suffering that comes with marriage to men. This is how men are to know that a woman is loyal. To make matters worse, in the year 2032, in his home state of Texas, the president brings back slavery and the exploitation of Black and brown people, known as debt slaves, eventually spreading slavery throughout the whole country. He does this through religious ideology and propaganda. It has been documented that Christian missionaries have exported patriarchal, anti-Indigenous, and anti-Black teachings through global missions. The Bible and Christian traditions were all imported into Africa by Europeans. Pashington Obeng suggests that Christianity made its way to the African continent around the 15th century. In the Ghanaian context, where I was born, Obeng shares that Ghanaian missionary efforts have been shaped by some of the following: Portuguese secular priests, the Portuguese Augustinians, the French and Spanish, the French Dominicans, and the Society of African Missions. Initially, much of Catholicism was relegated to the slave castles and trading forts along the coastal regions of Ghana. Because of this, locals native to the land were not immediately influenced by those outside religions. According to Obeng, it was not until 1503 that Ghanaians began to convert to Christianity. He says that by 1889, Catholicism had moved out of the coastal regions to other parts of Ghana, eventually making its way to Kumasi, the capital city of the Ashanti region, by 1905. Obeng shares that by 1924, the Catholic population in Ghana had reached 40,000. With this transition, African priests and nuns were trained by European missionaries to convert and train other Ghanaians. This process of conversion created tension between Ghanaians practicing indigenous spiritual traditions and those moving to Catholicism, what some considered to be the white man's religion. And I quote, increasing conversion rates in Ghana reflected that of other parts of Africa. According to Barbara Mann Wall, Africa has been the site of the most dramatic growth of Christianity. And Wall said this in 2015. Wall adds, In 1900, there were 2 million Catholics in Africa. Today, or rather at the time in 2015, there are over 165 million. 14% of Catholics globally live in Africa. 43% of all the world's baptism, over 1 million, take place on the African continent, says Wall. Additionally, Wall shared that by providing services such as medical and educational interventions to local communities, Europeans were able to increase the number of Africans converting to Catholicism. Subsequently, feminism and marriage equality were depicted as a threat to the institution of marriage. It has been said that feminism has turned women into men and thus should be abolished. The problematic and violent nature of Catholicism, however, we are just simply to gloss over and forgive. Speaking of truth and reconciliation, African shaman Malidoma Patrice Somé shares accounts of being taken, kidnapped from his family home to be raised by a French Catholic missionary in Burkina Faso, West Africa. Somé, who later escaped, speaks of violence and abuse at the hands of caretakers, often priests and nuns. Somé's missionary experience, particularly his escape, reads like a slave narrative. He literally talked about using the stars to find his way outside of the mission. His testimony runs parallel with those of indigenous communities in North America who were brought up in residential schools run by the American and Canadian government alongside churches of different denominations, including the Catholic Church, which has come under fire recently for the findings of unmarked bodies of children. There was 215 initially, and from my understanding, the numbers have gone up to at least well over 300 and counting. The church has still not offered or issued a significant apology. In the book, The Reason You Walk, Indigenous author and politician Wap Kinew shares stories of his father's experience as a residential school survivor in Ontario, Canada. Like many who have since come forward against the Canadian government and Catholic Church, Kinew's father was physically assaulted, sexually violated, and faced racism meant to, and I quote, eliminate the Indian out of the Native children. Essentially, his father was told never to speak his native language or wear cultural garb, both of which were punishable offenses, what others have noted as genocide. Similar to other Indigenous children globally, he was taught that Indigenous people were lesser than whites and made to love and appreciate what was external to him, including whiteness and the powers that it wielded. This was one way in which churches were used to suppress Black and Brown communities, successfully brainwashing them into believing that they were sinners by virtue of their ethnicity and race, and that only a white God or Jesus could save them, what can be accurately identified as anti-Black and anti-Indigenous racism. Octavia Butler provides social commentary on these repetitive patterns in history. Jared's crusaders found the tactic of public shaming particularly useful. Lauren reflects, "We were all lashed. The men were made to watch. We were marched out of the school and lashed as we were made to kneel and pray, to scream out our sins, to beg for forgiveness, and to quote Bible verses on command. I kept thinking they would make a mistake and kill some of us. This was an orgy of abuse and humiliation." And that quote is from page 211. Lauren says of the public shaming, actual beatings couldn't have left me feeling any worse. I remember wishing I could die. The idea of making someone ashamed in public was meant to be harder on the accused than physical violence, such as flogging or even imprisonment. In this regard, shame, because of its intense emotional discomfort, was powerful in getting people to comply, and in some cases, tougher on the accused than prison. Humiliation, because of how it strikes shame, functions as a disciplinary tool, one that works particularly well. Witnessing others in shame, in a humiliating state of shame at that, provides a remedy that is maladaptive. It makes us feel better about our own shame, or at the very least, feel not as bad. In the novel, Lauren observes, these men feast on our pain and they call us parasites. They lash us until they have orgasms. Our screams and convulsions and pleas and sobs are what these men need to feel sexually satisfied. And that is from page 233. This psycho and sociopathic delight that white men and women take in inflicting pain on others based on racial differences, among other signifiers. This has been raised by those such as Frantz Fanon, Doris Davenport, Mab Segrest, who all argue that while whiteness and white supremacy are not mental illnesses per se, the thinking, the actions, and the behaviors of white people have historically and to date been pathological in nature and far from normal. I said what I said. But of course, these white men and women, they saw and continue to see their bigoted ways as totally normal, believing that they are doing the right thing. They even go so far as to think that they're doing racialized people of color a favor. They view their violence as positive contributions to social progress. Okay. One they believed was rooted in love, viewing their actions as a sacrifice to God and the present. Does this sound familiar to you at all? Lauren elaborates, this is a quote, they believe in what they're doing. They do believe that we inmates are somehow enemies of the country. Their superiors have told them that parasites and heathens like us need to be brought down because we have brought down America the mighty. End quote. Page 233. With this justification in mind, they claim that their racist ideologies, among other forms of oppression and exploitative messaging, were rooted in service. They're just doing the world a favor. They look at us with unmistakable hatred, disgust, and contempt, and they insist it's love that they feel. Their God requires them to love us after all. And I quote, that's from page 248. These are Octavia Butler's words, eh? Don't come for me, go for her. And so their captors continue to abuse and mistreat them in the name of solidarity. As Michael Kimmel is who was white, he does white anti-racist work. As he eloquently explains, white men are the beneficiaries of the single greatest affirmative action program in the world. End quote. You can find that in Kimmel's book on page 8. I'm going to repeat that again. This is not my words. This is Michael Kimmel. Michael Kimmel is white. Go for Michael, not me. Okay? Let me repeat that again. As Michael Kimmel so eloquently explains, White men are the beneficiaries of the single greatest affirmative action program in the world. End quote. Page 8. And still they are hungry for more power and more domination and more control. Even with all the power and respect they demanded from everyone over the centuries, and given how much trauma and destruction they have caused all women, regardless of race, white men continue to play and claim victimhood. Oh, poor them. White North American men in particular. They throw some of the worst and most violently horrendous tantrums, including lynchings, pyromania, mass shooting massacres, and the threat of death, both online and off. After all they had negatively contributed to, white European descended men still claim to have it the hardest. Oh. According to Kimmel, they believe they face some of the harshest conditions on earth. But history dictates otherwise. How are you managing these white supremacist states during this COVID-19 pandemic? Unfortunately, unlike the virus, there is nowhere safe to shelter and hide from when it comes to white supremacy. Until next time, in solidarity.